Welcome, everybody, to this launch of the report of the International Panel on Social Progress, the IPSP. My name is Gustaf Arrhenius. I'm the director of the Institute for Future Studies that have been heavily involved in this report. What is this report? It is a rather gigantic project. It's over 300 researchers from all continents, from most subjects in the social science and humanities, that came together to write 22 chapters on the different pressing problems of today. The idea came up in Paris, actually, when the first time I heard about the idea, when I had lunch with Marc Fleurbaey, who is the main motor behind the report and who is with us here today. The idea was that we were discussing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and how fantastic it was, but also how tricky it was to get all these researchers together to get a kind of consensus or convergent position on climate change. And then I thought, why couldn't one do the same thing in the social science and humanities? It sounds like a crazy idea, but we were both convinced that there are a lot of good ideas around. And the differences between researchers are often exaggerated. The air we breathe is to criticize each other and find flaw in each other's theories. But there are also a lot of convergence. And we thought if we could bring people together, we could perhaps find some kind of convergent position. Of course, many of these good ideas also suffered, we thought, from not being treated interdisciplinary. It's very easy for a philosopher, I'm a philosopher, to come up with a grand idea, but if you want to move it on and become something feasible, you need sociologists, you need economists, you need all kind of different subjects to make it into something. So that was the idea behind this report. And as I said, it was a very big project, but it now actually exists. So there's 3 volumes, altogether 1,000 pages, dealing with all kinds of subjects. And now Marc has, with co-author, also written a kind of subjective summary, which is also translated to Swedish, which you can get today, which kind of in a very neat way presents the main findings of the report. So I'm very happy we come this far from 2013. We will have a lot of discussions from some of the authors of the chapters, from Marc Fleurbaey himself, and we will also have some critical discussion from people outside the report. All this will be run by our eminent moderator, Jens Orback, who will now take over. Jens.
Thank you very much. And Gustaf, may I take the opportunity to... Thank you. Wait with that.
Did they applaud you or me?
No, they applauded you, I think. No, I asked, when I read this manifest, I was a little struck because I've written some researches, but this was, you say gigantic, but grandiose in also talking about a new system. When I work as journalists, or many journalists at least say that they are, we use the word in Swedish, konsekvensneutral. They are neutral to the consequences of their report. And you could sometimes think that as a researcher, you say this is what we see, and the policy is given to someone else. But here you look into policy, to capitalism, socialism, equality, welfare. Have you become politicians?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
It is, of course. We do take a stand, but for each chapter, you have this different researcher. They had to come up. Can you find a somewhat convergent position? So in that sense, they have taken a stand, but it's not the opinion of one person. So in that way, and then you can compare with even with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They also have realized that if you want to give advice, you can't completely abstain from questions of value, from questions of what is a good society. So you have to move forward. Of course, you have to be very clear about it. You can't hide anything. And reason out from principles. And as we make clear in this report, there are a few principles that most people share. So in that sense, we only adhere to principles that most of us share, but not everybody, of course. So it will be controversial, I'm sure.
I guess, yeah, we share your views of equity, sustainability, freedom, but then you also give a lot of advices. Do you think that researchers, to some extent, are raising their voice too little?
Well, obviously, because I think this report is a great thing. I mean, I do think we should have a lot of respect for the democratic process, but I think researchers definitely have a role to play in that conversation, and they should raise their voice in that conversation. Then, of course, you have to go through all the hoops of the democratic process. But democracy works much better if there's a more well-informed discussion. And there is a lot of ideas here that I think the discussion would be much better if they were well-known. And that's what we hope to do with this report.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that discussion with help of a research-based manifesto, then, we would say. And you were also already mentioned Marc Fleurbaey, who is a professor in economics from Princeton University and one of the initiators to this book given out by IPSP. And that is a manifesto for social progress. And you have a long list. I Googled you as well. Also a professor of economy and written a number of reports concerning fairness, progress, welfare. And we will give you some time to have a broader view of the report. And then we will also talk to some of the authors or researchers for different chapters. And then we will have a discussion. And then, as you said, Gustaf, there is also an invitation for 4 other sectors here in Sweden. And that's the political one, and from academia, and from the civil society. And I forgot one more sector. That is, of course, the academia, environment. Yeah, of course, the business community as well. They will be the most critical, perhaps. We'll see. So the floor is yours, Marc. Give us an overview. And I also have a wish, and that is, since this subject is so broad, I guess you are coming here with very different hopes of this afternoon. And my hope would be that not many people leave and say, well, this most important question was not raised. So there will also be a freedom of speech in here. And we will give some time for your possibility to raise questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's really fantastic to be here presenting this work of a big group of people. So I'm very grateful for Gustaf, especially for organizing this, but also for his support over the years. It has taken many years, more than 3 years, to prepare this report. So the Institute for Future Studies and the Riksbanken Jubileum Fund have been great supporters. I mean, Sweden has been one of the strong countries in this report, as you can imagine. It's progressive in many ways, and so it's very helpful here. So I'll try to give you an overview of the situation in which we are now in the first part, and then I'll give another talk about our proposals for action and reforms in the second part of this afternoon. So, sources of worry and reasons for hope. So you have the real thing here. This is just a picture, and you have a picture of a part of the group that we had that was taken in Istanbul. So let me just mention, while I'm at different general things, you have a website, ipsp.org, where you can find a lot of resources. If you're a teacher, you find teaching resources. If you're a student, you can find drafts of the report in open access and so on. So you have videos with interviews of the authors and so on. There is even a movie that will be presented later today on this effort. So the objectives have already been addressed by the first 2 speakers, and why do researchers do that? I would like to mention that we do want indeed to influence the conversation, and not just policymakers, but also all change makers, people who are really part of the change of society, which happens in deeper layers and not just the high political levels. And we also hope to help to raise interest among our academic colleagues about long-term issues and structural issues. It's easy for academics to focus on the here and now, and perhaps sometimes the small policy issues. It's harder to think big, long-term, and structural. So we hope that will encourage research more in these areas. So as Gustaf said, we have three books which correspond to 3 parts. So we have one part on socioeconomic transformations, one part on governance and political issues, and one part which is the last in a way, but not the least, on the cultural changes, the big transformations in values that happen in societies. And in the final, in the last chapters, we also discuss some utopian transformative ideas that could be tested and experimented with. So what I will talk about now is more about this small book, which is, as Gustaf said, a subjective summary. So we wanted to convey a narrative in a very accessible way. So it's not a bland summary of the report. It's really taking a stand on various issues. And so I should make a caveat here. We are not speaking for the whole group of researchers of this, the 260 authors who really wrote that. We are speaking in the name of the small group of authors who did that, but we take a strong inspiration from the report when we wrote that. So let me focus first on the first part. And we have to, of course, many people are critical and anxious about our times, but we first have to celebrate the great achievements that have been observed since, especially since, I would say, the last war, the last World War. So big growth, big economic growth, big success on poverty reduction. Extreme poverty has declined a lot, and China has been behind that. So I'm not sure you can easily see everything on the slides. I'm sorry, and given that we want to keep time for discussion, I'll sometimes jump over the slides. But I want really just you to be convinced that this is based on real statistics and not on fake news. So this is just to convey this impression. So big success on health. Globally, so improvement in life expectancy, infant mortality and maternal mortality, and education as well, and so on. Also success on the political side, decolonization, and deepening and expansion of democracy to many countries. But there are alarming trends, so people are right to be anxious. If you look at Africa in particular, the future of Africa is quite uncertain. And one element is that the poverty rate, so the proportion of people who are poor in Africa has been declining, but the absolute number of poor people in Africa is not declining because population is still growing. Global inequalities. So there is this curve which describes how various people in the world and different places of the distribution have benefited from globalization. And we see that we have, in the middle, people have benefited quite a lot. And this is especially the Asian people, the new middle class of the world. But you have people in the very bottom of the distribution who have been left behind. And you have people here. So the people who are here are the poor people, the bottom half people in Europe and the United States who have been left behind and who have been hit by globalization and technical change. And these are the Brexit voters, these are the Trump electors, and so on. These are perhaps the Swedish Democrat electors as well. And so you have concerns about these inequalities both within countries and globally. So if you look at the figures at the bottom here, you have the growth of various regions of the world where you see that in terms of relative, so these are relative how regions stand with respect to the US. So you see an apparent relative catch-up. But you actually, if you look at the absolute gap, so this is the absolute levels, the absolute gap remains very very high, and this is something that is worrisome. We have some worries about demographics. I was talking about population in Africa, but also aging is a problem, especially for developed countries. Of course, the environment is a serious problem. You are the country where the concept of planetary boundaries has been invented, and we are hitting hard some of these boundaries. The climate problem with the rise in temperature, but also water stress, pollution, and all these sort of things have been worsening. Migrations is an issue, so we see the trend here. In terms of proportion of the population, it is not that big. It is around 3.3% of the total population is now out of its birth country. And the problem of migration is actually concentrated a lot in the neighboring countries where you have crisis, so especially in the Middle East. But somehow the political upheaval is happening in countries where you don't have that many migrants like the US or Europe. violence. So we live in peaceful times, if you take a very, very long-term perspective, but nevertheless we see worrisome trends recently, increase in conflicts, and a sharp increase in terrorist incidents. Again, we talk a lot about terrorist attacks in the developed world, but in fact most of the terrorist attacks happen in the developing world. And the problem is that all these alarming trends can feed one another. So you can have vicious cycles that worsen the situation. So this is just, I won't go through all the arrows here to discuss the causal links, but my favorite story up to recently was the following. You have, for instance, something like a drought for several years in Syria that creates a fertile ground for conflict and upheaval, leading to the creation of the ISIS state and a migration crisis, which then destabilizes certain political systems, like in Europe and in the US. And for instance, what happens in such systems, like in the US, leads to a crumbling of global cooperation, which can worsen, for instance, if the US gets out of the Paris Agreement, it can worsen the environmental problem, and so on and so forth. And it can also lead, at some point, I said it was my favorite story, that was kind of a joke, but at some point we are very worried that there could be a nuclear war with North Korea, so that could have been a distant consequence of this thing, right? So we should indeed be worried. And what are the drivers of this trend? So you have globalization, of course, globalization of trade, decrease in tariffs, globalization of capital flows, so the so-called liberalization of capital accounts. You have an increase in transportation, so you have the air transport here, you have the internet subscribers here, the mobile phone subscriptions. So you have now one mobile phone subscription per person in the world. Of course, not everybody has a mobile phone, but many people have several subscriptions. And you have so globalization is one key driver, and technical change is another key driver. So automation, the number of robots is expected to continue to climb at an exponential rate. You have the share of labor in the production system, which is declining. It's declining. Its share in the pie that is produced is declining, but its relative proportion with respect to capital in the production system is also declining. And you have what is called the de-routinization, which is that the middle jobs, which are both manual and intellectual jobs, which are easy to replace by algorithms and robots, are getting depleted. And here you see for various countries the fact that the middle-paying jobs have a lower increase in job creations, or a decrease in absolute terms, whereas you have an increase in the extreme. So you have the very low-paying service jobs on one hand, and the high-style jobs. And you have similar things happening in the US, where you can see when this started to happen. And this started to happen around the 80s, right? So it's not something that is just now. It really is a long-term trend. So some people sometimes say, is it really, what is worse? Is it globalization, or is it the technical change? In fact, this debate is a bit moot, because both of these drivers feed into one another. They reinforce one another. We had globalization because technical change made it possible and easier, and similarly, globalization expands the possibilities for technical diffusion, and so on. And so that creates the worrisome digital divide and widening gap between firms, those that are successful and those that are left behind, and people, of course, not just firms. One key message we want to convey is that both globalization and technical change are not exogenous, autonomous processes that happen like that and we can do nothing about them. In fact, they are directed. They are led by institutions and incentives that we create through our policies. So we need to be aware of that. And if we are aware of that, we realize we can do something about these drivers. So you have now two tales about these inequalities which are popular. One is an anti-globalization narrative. It blames globalization. It wants to go back to a closed world. And you have the anti-neoliberalism narrative, which essentially would like to go back to the 70s and the welfare state before the Reagan and Thatcher era. So we need to go beyond that, not just look at the past, but try to imagine something for the future. We cannot go back to a closed world with the welfare state of the old system. Now I'd like to talk about good news, because there is something that is reassuring on the side of values. There is what we could call, and we borrow from my colleague Peter Singer, a philosopher at Princeton, who is quite famous for pushing animal rights and so on. We have the circle of respect and dignity is expanding. What does that mean? So if we look at our conception, our relation to nature, we are moving from a conception of exploiting nature, dominating nature, to a conception that is more, we are part of nature, we have to nurture nature. We have a growing awareness of planetary boundaries, I was saying, and we have greater support for animal rights. So these are the countries where you have legislation against animal suffering, and you have here a survey in the US showing the support for the idea that animals deserve the same rights as people by demographic groups. So here you see the women, for instance, in recently 42% agree with this sentence. And as for other things, men are really behind. I mean, only 22. So usually they are way behind the women in this kind of opinion survey. We have something interesting, which is the emergence of the idea of civil society as a driving force of solidarity. Beside what happens on the market, the economy, and the state. And so a big rise in the number of NGOs, what is called the third sector, the non-profit sector, and of course the social media. This is something new, which perhaps offers new forms of organization which can be interesting. Our conception of differences between people has been changing. There used to be a time when differences meant that people were in a natural hierarchies. You had the women below the men, the servants below the masters, and so on. This is disappearing. Now we talk about inequality, right, and no longer about natural hierarchies. And this, of course, has to do with the way of life, the emergence of the nation state, some centuries ago already, and the notion of a citizen, but also the spread of the urban life. There is this question of whether we should be universalistic about human rights, and so always a debate about that. So I'll come back to that later, but we argue that it's good to have some universal push for certain basic rights. And here you have surveys about homosexuality and women's job, whether it is only household or potentially something else. So we see trends at the world level, so this is at the world level, which go in a clear direction of more acceptance. And if we look at the future, what's interesting is that it's not just in the developed world that things are happening. You see initiatives in various countries. So it's not just the Western civilization spreading over the world. No, we have things happening in the developing world in different ways, but still converging towards some form of humanism. South Africa, the Latin American things on participatory governance or the ecology perspective in the Andes, and also even in the Middle East, you have interesting things happening. And so what we argue for is that we should think not of a convergence or of a clash between cultures, but a coevolution of cultures, not necessarily converging, but moving together toward a dialogue which helps them progress for more humanistic values. Education is an essential thing. We won't have much time to talk about education, but it's one of the most important aspects of policy that can help. And of course, we hear a lot about backlash these days. There are many things happening which are worrisome. For instance, violence against gays in many countries and so on. But if you take the very long-run picture, it's really good. The natural hierarchies are not coming back. And finally, I'm close to the end of this first part. We have a chapter about the big challenge of our time. The big challenge of our generation, and perhaps I should say of the next generation, the young people. Now that I'm a bit gray, I should talk about the next generation. So we need to pursue three goals at the same time. Equity, which is reducing inequalities. Sustainability, tackling the environmental issues, preserving the future. And freedom, which means both basic rights, but also democratic rights, participation of people. And we can imagine various ways in which we will fail in achieving these three goals at the same time. And this corresponds, if you fail on one of them, it gives you three scenarios. So if you fail on equity and reducing inequalities, you have what we call the Apartheid scenario. If you fail on freedom, you have the authoritarian scenario. And if you fail on sustainability, you have the Fukuyama scenario, the end of history scenario. So the apartheid scenario the idea is very simple. We could try to preserve the environment by keeping half of the planet poor, right? So if these people don't consume, that will help preserving the environment. But this is not a viable solution. this will create a lot of conflicts, migrations, and problems that will really make this not viable. But we could imagine this happening. It's perhaps we are actually already on this scenario. So we see this is the world in 1988. So you had the poor people and the advanced countries. Now China, you have China here above the other countries. China has done a sort of landslide, moving toward, catching up and moving toward the rich countries. If it continues like that and the others are left behind, we'll have another bimodal distribution in the future, where we would have a separation between the rich people and those who are left behind. The end of history scenario, the Fukuyama scenario, would say, okay, let's try to pursue this vision of a market economy with a liberal democracy and with good policies for equality and so on. So the problem with this idea is that we can perhaps succeed in doing that, but it is not sustainable for the environment. If everybody lives like we live, actually I live in the US now, so Sweden is a green country compared to the US. In the US, the level of energy consumption is totally appalling. And so if everybody was trying to imitate the US lifestyle, the planet would explode very quickly. And so unless we have a very important technical breakthrough, making it possible to have the kind of lifestyle we have with green consequences, this is not going to happen. And if you look at the path that the developing countries like China and so on are following nowadays, they are not leapfrogging. So this idea of leapfrogging is they would switch directly to more advanced technologies which would be greener. This is not really happening. They actually take lifestyle. So you have curves here of the level of development and the level of energy consumption. So the emerging countries are here, which means that for the same level of development as other countries before them, they are actually apparently consuming more energy. And finally, the authoritarian scenario, we could perhaps call it the Chinese scenario, is a scenario where we would curb the population, which would be good for the environment, and we would be very authoritarian on lifestyle and urban design. And this is a scenario which could work. I mean, sometimes people look at China saying, this is how they are doing things. It's not going to work generally, because authoritarianism is really prone to failures, corruption, abuses of power, and so on. So this is something that's not going to happen. So the conclusion here is we need to pursue each of these three goals: equity, sustainability, and freedom. And if we fail on one, we'll fail overall, right? So each is necessary. It may be tough to achieve the three of them, but we need to try. And there is no historical determinism. If we have to try, and if we have many choices to make, and we are really at a crossroads. Thank you.
We will come back to a talk with some of your colleagues, but you ended up saying we are at the crossroad. Would you say that what you describe here is a revolution? Is it a really big shift, or is it because the first curves that you showed was a remarkable development during the last 100 years? So will you just gear it a little bit, or would you consider this a major shift?
Actually, it's not really a major shift in the sense that we can achieve a lot of progress, both in terms of institutions, using known recipes, deepening democracy, while making the most of technical progress to decouple growth from the use of resources and the destruction of the environment. So we can do a lot by tweaking the system, and we'll talk more about that in the second half, rather than imagining a complete upheaval of everything.
Thank you. We'll come back to that then. Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to one of the writers of this book. It's Kerstin Sahlin, who is a professor of organization science at the Uppsala University, and you will talk a little bit about the conclusions in the chapter regarding markets, finance, and corporations.
Yes, that's right. Nice to be here. So in this manifesto, in the introduction, a remark is made that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are very thoughtfully structured around the notion of life of dignity, but remain quite vague as far as institutional reform is concerned. So institutions the rules, the regulations, the way in which the world is organized, how actions are framed and based. So the chapter on market, finance, and corporation, chapter 6 in, let's see, in the green one, is really dealing with some of the basic institutions of our modern world, namely the market, finance, and corporations, and asks the question, does capitalism have a future? So it traces the history, the transformations, and the variations of these institutions. And these insights lead to suggestions for how to transform institutions to support social progress. And a positive reading of this chapter is that we don't need a revolution, but we need to support hopes for how these institutions are being transformed constantly and maybe push them a bit more into the right direction so that they can support rather than hinder social progress. So we cannot turn the clock back, of course, and that's not what we want either, but the historical insights of this chapter show that institutions are not made once for all, but they constantly transform, and in order to understand how they transform, we can also think about how to push them in the right direction. I should say that this chapter has benefited a lot from economic history and legal expertise that is quite far from what I know, and I have limited knowledge on those areas, and that's the beauty of being part of these big projects, that you get to collaborate with people that have much expertise in different areas. So I will just give a few remarks that are, of course, as always, framed by my own experiences and interests. And I will primarily focus my comments on a bit on regulation and on the role of corporations. And I will end by saying something about how I see what role has research played in this context and what role can research play in this context. So a few very quick words on some central insights of the chapter. The chapter shows a transformation from legal national regulation to deregulation and soft self-regulations. This has to do, of course, with globalization, and in this context, the limits of national regulation, and also a wave of deregulation that was more ideologically driven from 1980s and onwards. It also touches upon what role does the state have in relation to the market in this context. And it states and shows that markets need to be regulated and organized. And maybe the states have shifted somewhat from regulating markets, reviewing and inspecting markets, to viewing their view of sort of promoting markets rather, and being sort of in competition among themselves to, for example, attract corporations and capital. So it's an interstate market and a market of goods and services and corporations at the same time. A second institutional transformation concerns the governance and purpose of corporations. During the last decades, we have seen a clear dominance and a clear view of corporations that is framed as shareholder value. And that is contrasted to what is often talked as a stakeholder value and governance. So what is the purpose of a corporation? With a shareholder value, it is increasingly seen as maximizing the value return of the shareholders. And that is seen as the prime motive for corporations. And shareholders are seen as owners of corporations and those who should control what is going on there. Not as investors, but as those who really own and control. At the same time, we have a regulation that limits the responsibility for those owners, limited liability. So with this shareholder view being very much spread, we get corporations that are looking at the financial return primarily, and the chapter argues that this also fosters a short time horizon. So we cannot plan for longer time, for indirect returns, and for the broader effects and impacts of corporate activity. This notion, by the way, of shareholder value has spread so much in the society. So we also talk about public service. This is not in the chapter, but my own reflection. So much so that we also now talk about most public bodies as owned by the government, as having a shareholder value. So universities are now often described as owned by the government. So the government should be those that have influence on it. So back to the chapter. This spread of the shareholder value is contrasted to a purpose of corporations that follow on a stakeholder view of corporations. Corporations that produce value for all stakeholders, including customers, and maybe at best today's customers and tomorrow's customers, for workers, for the society at large, and for investors. And in this view, the corporation should be also seen as separated from the owners, so that is a relation, not the same. The transformation of regulation that I mentioned is largely a result, as I say, of globalization and the changed role of the state. But when it comes to governance and roles of corporations, this is largely a result of theoretical conceptualization. This idea of shareholder value as equal to corporate activity is sort of formed by theoretical conceptualizations. So with development from the 1970s and onwards, this theoretical notion of shareholder value has come to be so much more dominant than the stakeholder value. And I think that researchers have a responsibility in this, and research has a role to play here. So if we also think that with this shareholder, where the financial direct results of the investments are the prime motive for investing in corporations, we also get close to seeing speculations where you move corporations around in order to get the best return in a short run. The products that are produced become second to the financial results that are received. Now, if this is true, and in such a short time, I of course paint with a very broad brush here. Are there any hopeful tendencies? Yes, says this chapter. There are many hopeful tendencies, and I would just like to point to one such tendency that can be of great hope, even in the present system, and where we don't need a revolution, but sort of transformations of norms, but also regulatory setups and governance modes. And one such hope that the chapter points to is the corporate social responsibility trend, where it holds hope for a transformation to more of a stakeholder view of governance and corporations, where corporations are really encouraged to look more at the broad consequences and the broader context and more long-term consequences of which they are operating. So with this, they say maybe, And the chapter goes on to discuss whether we need special regulatory setups to promote this further. Now it's a voluntary development where it's very much leaning on media to report, etc. But maybe with this, we get sort of more of a stakeholder view back. The last few minutes, I would like to have a final reflection, and that is the role of research for social progress, because I think that this whole report is extremely interesting to read with those eyes. The role of research for social progress. Where does the state come in? And the chapter has a big discussion on whether state funds research on pharmacy, for example, and then the corporations take over. What is the responsibility for the corporations to give back to the society at large? And then there is this example I mentioned with shareholder value, where the theoretical development coming from research has had enormous impact on the way in which we view corporations and markets and the long-term consequences of what corporations do. And then we have a third way to read what is the role of research for the society and for social progress. And that is the report as such, where a lot of researchers come together, try to summarize their findings, and really are pushed to draw conclusions when it comes to what can we learn about society, how can we help society to reflect upon itself, and can we even draw some policy advice for how to reform the society for the future. And I hope that we can come back to this about what is the role of science and research in social progress. So thank you.
Just a yes or no question. You said, you started off saying we have tried to look in if does capitalism have a future? So the answer is?
Yes. I mean, that's how I read it, but it's open for reading several. But I think that this chapter gives a lot of support that sort of institutional transformation that has gone on, and I tried to show that with the purpose of the corporation and also the regulation and deregulation of markets. So we're just pushing a bit, and I think that this idea, the hopeful writings on corporate social responsibility, a development that really comes from within both the corporate sector and from the world at large, are signs that we need transformation, and we need to push it a bit in this and this direction. But I think that this chapter really agrees that we have varieties of capitalism. That's another chapter also in the report. So yes, I think that it's a common view in many of the chapters that capitalism has a future, but maybe a more regulated and a
democratic.
less, in many ways, more democratic, a stakeholder capitalism, so to speak.
Thank you very much. Okay, another writer and participant is Denny Wågerö, who is a professor of medical sociology at Chess at the Stockholm University. And you will talk a little bit about global health and the changing contours of human life. And also, I guess you also said, will say something about how you can have it applicable in Sweden.
I will.
Yeah, looking forward.
And if I can have my slides there, it will be easier.
Hopefully. Perhaps you need to press something.
Oh, that's what's me.
Okay, that's me. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I was a member of the chapter 18. It's more than a dozen authors to that chapter. And we speak about global health. Let me see if I can manage this one. And the contours, changing contours of human life, is a large chapter, and we were many people, as I said. I will reflect mainly on one part of it. And the question is, global health, what are the trends? Are they okay, or should we be concerned? And that's what I will speak about. If you look here at this picture here, that's it's a picture from Kibera in Nairobi. It's a very big slum area. Child mortality there, under 5 mortality is around 1 in 5, almost. 1 of 5 children doesn't reach their 5th birthday. What a waste of human life, isn't it? And so we should be concerned about global health. But at the same time, looking at child health, it gives us one of the best examples of what can be done. Child health has been going down enormously, as Marc showed you already. So that's also, we have a problem, but the problem is actually getting smaller on that area. How do we recognize progress? And this is a quote from the Sarkozy Commission, 2009. They were concerned about the focus on GDP per capita, and as you know, all governments are obsessed with GDP per capita and the competitive standing of their own country vis-à-vis other countries and so on. They think in economic terms very much. Sarkozy Commission said that the time is ripe for our measurement system to shift emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being. And that one part of people's well-being is health, of course. If you ask people what they value most in life, very many people will say put health as the first place above richness and status. So it's a very relevant question, how does global health evolve? And this is shows you the development in life expectancy during a 60-year period from the beginning, which is 1955. Let's see if I can. Oops, now I'm moving backwards. All right, I'll try to show you. The big line here, the fat line here, that's average global life expectancy. As you can see, during this 60-year period, there is more than 20-year improvement in global life expectancy. It's an enormous achievement by the world population. In spite of having an enormously growing world population, we also have a population that lives longer. So you can say this is the positive aspect of global health. This is only the 25 largest countries, but it looks the same if you look at all of them. But you can see also that here, the variation in each line is a country. The variation in life expectancy between countries 2015 and 1955 is very large, actually. It's several decades. And it's, so we have an enormous inequality in life expectancy in the world. And people have been trying to measure that inequality, and this is what they come up with. This is based on comparing every country in the world with every other country in the world. About 180 countries you compare with another 180 countries with each other. And then you calculate an average distance between countries. And this is called the dispersion measure of mortality. And as you can see here, up to this point, which is 1990, roughly, there's a convergence of mortality trends. The equality is growing, inequality is getting smaller. But after 1990, there is a change. And it's a very important point to look at. What is it actually that happens around there, that period? And if you look at closer to this, you see there's 2 continents that actually give you the answer. The first one is Africa, and that's got to do with the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. The other part of the world is Europe, surprisingly enough, and I'm going to show you what it looks like in Europe. This is European countries according to the WHO definition of Europe, which spans 53 countries, all Eastern Europe and into Central Asia as well. And for men and women, you can see between 1970 and 2010, you can see the difference in life expectancy. Each line here is a country. And to look here at the men, for instance, you have in 2010, that is, there's a difference here, which is quite large. It's 17 years, it's 20 years here between the best and the worst country. The red line there is the former Soviet Union. It's the republics of the Soviet Union, which is showing an enormously negative picture. From 1970 to 2010, you have a stagnation here. This is before the collapse of the communist system, which is around here. You got a stagnation, and then you have a fall, and then you have got some catching up. But the enormous divergence in mortality trends in Europe is striking, and it shows how important the political developments are. They coincide very much, these trends, with if you're on the eastern or the western side of Europe. So let's move away from that point and look at an African country, and that's South Africa here. And you have the blue line here is the life expectancy trend in South Africa, and you have a big fall in life expectancy. It's got to do with the AIDS epidemic, but not only. It also coincides with the change of the abolition of the Apartheid systems. And that's change in life expectancies changing, and then it's improving again. You can look again at the green line here, which is GDP per capita, the economic growth. They don't coincide. And the point to make here is just that economic growth and GDP, as GDP per capita, and life expectancy or health, as you measure it, they're related, but they are not a one-to-one relation. There's a big difference, and can be a big difference. And that's been studied in particular by a guy called Samuel Preston. And this is so-called Preston curve. And if I can show you, what you see here is each dot here is a country. And you have, in this way, you're getting richer and richer, countries getting richer and richer. The first line is 1930, and the second line in 1960s. And what you see is that the richer a country gets, the less important the economy is for GDP per capita. That's true in the 1930s, and that's true in the 1960s. The Preston curves show that there's a diminishing return on economic growth in terms of health. And when you have very rich countries, it doesn't matter so very much if you improve your GDP per capita even more. The top line there is from the 1960s, and here's a later, 30 years later picture. And you have the same Preston curve again. Rich countries, if they improve their GDP per capita, it doesn't actually give very much in terms of health. What does give more instead is what you do with the money you have, how you spend them. Do you spend them on arms, or do you spend them on social policies, schools, healthcare, and so on? Of course, that plays a role. Income differences within a country is also very important for the health of the nation. So the simple solution just to focus on GDP per capita is not a good idea if you're interested in improving global health. Rich countries, I'm going to say something about very rich countries. This was a report in the International Herald Tribune 6 years ago. Life expectancy drops for least educated whites in the United States. You've seen this probably, many of you. What one found was that there was a reduced life expectancy in people with lower than college education. This was based on a paper by Olshansky and other people. Differences in life expectancy due to race and educational differences are widening, and many may not catch up. What they say in this paper is that we have a long-term trend from 1990 to 2008 in the United States, where inequality differences between educated and non-educated, high and low educated people are growing. Life expectancy differences are growing all the time. It's a long-term trend. It's not just something that happens 1 year or so. It's a long-term trend. And in fact, it's not just that the differences are growing. It's also that the group, the low-educated group, the low-educated white group is falling backwards in life expectancy. This was picked up by Angus Deaton and Anne Case in 2015. what they note, and this became a big news item, rising morbidity mortality midlife among white non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st century. They were saying here, let's see if I can focus on that. It doesn't make it easier, does it? Well, this change reversed decades of progress in mortality and was unique to the United States. I'll come back to that because that's not quite true, actually. But what they noticed was that in midlife, there was in general in America deterioration of life expectancy. Mortality was rising in that group. And what they actually noticed was, what they pointed to was an epiphenomenon, you can call it. Behind that was the growing class differences, if you want, between high and low educated groups in the United States, which was of the size that it actually made the average go down, life expectancy go down on average. And that's why we are today. The last 2 years in the United States have got a slightly falling life expectancy, not very much, a couple of months, something like that. So it's a small, but there actually is a stagnation in life expectancy trends in the United States, the richest country in the world. It's not unique to the United States. This is what it looks like if you look at Russia, and this is the period 1989 to 2001. People with university education, which is the green line, and the elementary education, which is the red line. And you see that during this period from 1989 to 2001, there's a steadily growing gap in life expectancy. And the large group of people with just elementary school, which is the biggest group, are going backwards in life expectancy. So that is also why the country as a whole go back. It's not quite life expectancy because it's something called 45 P20, which means the probability that you survive 45 years if you're 20 years old. But it reflects the same phenomena, that life expectancy trends in rich countries like United States and Russia are very problematic, and because one group, one large segment of the population is going backwards. This ends 2001, and we don't know what's happened after 2010. There's a catch-up in Russia after 2005, roughly. So maybe this is not the case, but it shows that there's no guarantee at all that a country which is rich will be actually doing well in health terms. Well, there was two superpowers, or maybe ex-superpowers. This is a welfare state, Sweden, and this is a trend from 1990 to 2014. And if you're in life expectancy again, remaining life expectancy at age 30 by education. And you can see the favorable development among university-educated women compared to those with elementary education. There's a stagnation in this group. They don't actually improve very much. And if you look at the very latest statistics, which is came out about 2 weeks ago, the last 2 years, the last year, 2017, there's a 2-month reduction in life expectancy among women with elementary education. And if you can see, it's a big growth of this inequality. Here is 3 years in 1994, 3 years difference. Here it is 5 years, and today is 6. So we have a very negative trend also in Sweden, even if you can say that it's okay because the elementary group is doing better and better each year. But the inequality is also growing year by year. And this trend doesn't start 1990, it starts in 1970. So we have a 40-year-long period. This is a paper which compares 3 welfare states, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, for 1971 to 2000. All 3 countries have the same picture, that absolute differences in mortality or in life expectancy are growing during this period in all 3 countries. Welfare countries with big provisions for medical care, health, schools, and so on. How come that this is happening? And then this is the crux of the matter. What is it actually that happens in not even the best, perhaps the best welfare states we know cannot reduce inequalities? This is an editorial in the British Medical Journal a month ago. Reversals in life expectancy in high-income countries, ? Warning signs must not be ignored. And they discussed what's happening in America and, for instance, and other countries where there's problems. In Britain, there is a discussion about if austerity is behind the stagnation in life expectancy in Britain. So a lot of these rich countries, which have done very well so far, are actually not necessarily doing so well before. They have to tamper with large and growing inequalities. And to summarize this content, and global health has improved tremendously. People live longer on average. So we have a very positive trend, and that's important to state that in the world. Global health is getting better if you measure global health with life expectancy, which is not the only way of measuring it, but is probably the best way so far. But convergence of global mortality trend is now replaced by divergence, and that happens around 1990, 85, 90. Within countries, health inequalities are mostly growing larger. It's not true in every country, but in very many countries where there is statistics, we can see that we have a trend of growing inequalities, even in countries with comprehensive welfare systems like the Nordic countries. And the question is what is happening and why this is happening. One of the reasons is that politics for health are not on the top of government's agendas. If you remember the election campaign we had very recently in Sweden, there wasn't anyone who talked about life expectancy or health. But there are many people who spoke about medical care, queues to operations, and that kind of thing. That's where the focus is. But the bigger structural questions that actually drive public health or population health in the country were not in focus, and it is not in focus. You can also, after Kerstin's talk, you can also say that corporations and companies are not so very concerned about health either. That's not on the top of their agenda. So we have to actually put it much higher on the agenda to get the change in this area. Thank you. That's useless.
Thank you, Denny. May I ask you, I don't know if I can sort it out right, but do you think that inequality in itself is also a reason for higher mortality? Although the lowest population are on a better level than before, that inequality in itself creates...
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a Wilkinson question, Richard Wilkinson question, where he claimed that inequalities in them, large inequalities in themselves will actually promote a psychological climate in society which will be bad for everyone. I don't think it's proven, but it's a valid hypothesis actually. And the thing to say here is that even the worst groups in Sweden, for instance, and Norway and Finland, as I showed, have got an improvement in life expectancy or in health. But they are actually lagging behind more and more by every year. And the second best group is also lagging behind the best group. So the inequality is not just something that happens on the bottom among the poor. It's something that is structural. And that is this, and what's driving the health inequalities must be social inequalities at large. And that is a bad thing, I think, actually. Yeah.
Okay, may I from that ask perhaps Marc or the other ones in the panel here on what is actually research and what is views? I saw in one of the diagrams in the book the views of inequality, and I think the question was raised: do we need more income differences? Do we need should we have small income differences, unchanged or larger? And it was almost a third of all of them. They were decreasing a little bit, so they wanted smaller. But there were 3 different views on it. And when I studied as economist, for instance, I was also taught of one theory that if it rains a lot on the rich one, it will trickle down on the poor, so it's an incentive for all. So Marc, is this actually views that you are handed out here.
Yeah, so as Gustaf was saying at the very beginning, this is a question that haunts all panels, right? When you try to make an assessment of a field of research, where do you stop? And so the IPCC has a mantra, which is we should be, the IPCC report should be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And somehow they should just summarize the state of the situation without making recommendations. In our panel, we changed that. We decided we would try to give recommendations for a very simple reason, which is that our audience is really eager to receive suggestions of things that can be done. And what we need to do if we give recommendations is just to be transparent about the values that underlie these recommendations, right? So I've talked, for instance, about equity, sustainability, and freedom. These are things that most people embrace, right? And so the question is, if we want to pursue these goals, what can be done that is consistent with these goals? And that's where research is useful. So essentially, our role as researchers is to bridge the gap between the goals of the people and the means that can help them achieve these goals.
Kerstin?
I think that if you compare the chapter I've been part of and you compare it with Denny's presentation here, you have two very different kinds of research, but both are research-based. Here you measure and you draw conclusions from looking at how different trends are related. But in our chapter, it's much more tracing sort of the views in society and the taken for granted notions that are behind very many of the regulations and the developments here in the market and in the corporate sector, and behind the sort of the spread of ideas about how to regulate and deregulate. So we need to think of research as a very broad sort of portfolio of methods, but what it has in common is a very systematic written and reflection on your data and your conclusions.
When you compare with the climate panel, and I think most people would say that they say we are in a hurry, something has to be done. Is it the same? And you say there's a connection between social progress and the climate. So would you say that we are in a big hurry here as well, Gustaf? Is that why you supported this?
Could I start with saying something about your first question?
Yes, if you answer the one later on.
I promise. Yeah. No, just to be clear that those diagrams that Marc showed, that was studies of people's views. So that's descriptive, done by sociologists, anthropologists.
Actually done at your institute.
Yeah.
That was the World Value Survey.
Exactly. So that is the World Value Survey. That sees that people are, all over the world, you can see kind of a movement, how people change their values towards valuing autonomy and self-realization more. So that's just descriptive. Then, what you were pushing us, what about this? Aren't you making kind of value, assuming values in the report? And as Marc mentioned, I mentioned earlier too, to a certain extent, yes, but you make them very clear. And they are hopefully values that is a very broad kind of acceptance about. For example, autonomy. Most people and self-realization, that's something most people care about. So that's the idea there. Then, and Marc referred to the climate panel and saying that they should not make any prescription, but actually, it's actually worse, I think, when you hide certain value assumptions, and there are value assumptions even from the IPCC. I mean, you can talk about what's called the discount rate. How much should you value future harms compared to present harms, and things like that. And that's a very big discussion that also come up now with the price, the economic price to Alfred Nobel's memory with Nordhaus, who have certain views on that are rather controversial. So they are always this. It's very hard to avoid them. It's better to come out with them. Then now, so what was your question now?
Should we be alarmistic? Are we in a big hurry? Is there a
yes.
need for change?
Yes, when it comes to climate change, obviously. But I mean, I also think there is clearly, if you want things to move forward, you need to have some kind of visions or blueprints. Otherwise, I don't think much is going to happen, or we might just close up on ourselves if we don't see any kind of attractive way forward.
We had a prime minister for a long time in Sweden called Tage Erlander, and he once said that a way to get opinion building, to get the movement, is to identify who your enemy is. So if I rephrase it, who would lose from this change? Who would be the possible enemy or resistance when it comes to the ideas?
You want me to try? Yeah, so I think what the key message here is that many people will lose if we don't change. And the urgency, so Gustaf was right that the climate change is one of the urgent things. But you know, people talk about tipping points in the climate and the earth system. But I believe that actually what will happen due to environmental degradation is that the first tipping point that will hit us are the social and economic tipping points. So the disorganization of our socioeconomic system due to conflicts and disruption of the political system. So the example I gave, starting with the drought in Syria, which is a symptom of climate change, really, but has consequences in political systems. So we do have urgency also in the current unraveling of democracies. We might have a dictatorship coming back to Brazil very soon. And so this is the kind of situation we are in. We had our first meeting of the authors all together in 2015 in Istanbul in Turkey. We would not be able to do the same meeting again now in Turkey because some of us would not be able to attend because of the new policy. And so we are really in a situation where we have a retreat of democratic values in certain countries and an unraveling of institutions, a decrease in trust. People have low trust in the institutions. So we have to fight very urgently to restore. In the small book, we talk about a chasm, right? So we've been growing a lot, but we now face a chasm. And if we want to continue progressing, we really need to bridge the gap that we face in front of us.
I will just say that what we are discussing here is a little bit on how does it look. Later, after coffee, we would look in more on what to do about it, but it's floating in between. But I would also give you an opportunity if you have any questions. I saw that your hands were up there. So I will start with them and then you will come. And I don't know, do we have a portable microphone, Erika?
I hope so.
Yes.
The question about are we in a hurry, I think, I don't know how much in a hurry we are, but things could change quite fast, actually. If you look at the best example of a very fast change situation is the collapse of the Soviet system, where you had a fall in life expectancy in 7 years, by 7 years in 7 years. 1 year, something roughly like that. So it doesn't have, social factors are very penetrating on health in various ways. And a collapse of a system, we could easily imagine that ecological disasters, migration crisis, and climate changes will make societies collapse. And in that case, we will see could see a big change in the health of those populations. So I don't think we should be complacent. We should
that could
fast.
also be used as an argument, don't change system, because we can see the cost of system change in your
Well,
graphs.
the system which we have now is not a good system for as I showed, because it doesn't actually promote health in the same way as it did in the past. Up to 1990 maybe, but not today. It doesn't work like that. We see different forces. We have unleashed global forces that actually are tearing societies apart, more or less. And I think that's what we see on the health areas.
Kerstin?
Well, in this chapter, it's we are warned if there is a financial crisis around the corner, and we have read in the newspapers during the past few weeks that we are really, well, many people say we are most certainly going towards a financial crisis. You can take the view that they come and go, but if you read this chapter with those views, you can say that at least we can, if we know more about the institutional setup of the world and how much regulation we need, we can at least deal with the crisis in a better way. So in that sense, we are really in a hurry to think about how can we make markets, corporation, and finance to serve social progress in a better way. I think it is a very good point. I mean, if we have more of a stakeholder view, both of the regulated market and the stakeholder view of corporations. And we accept that corporations are really main drivers of the development of society, together with states and civil society, etc. Of course, if we have more inclusive corporations where people feel that they are heard, not only exploited, they will also together promote a more social security society. So yes, you are definitely right. It comes with this, that more inclusive corporations, more stakeholder views of corporations are also serving the society to become less insecure and less divided in itself.
When you worked with this book, you had different panels discussing different chapters. Was it also a possibility to identify low-hanging fruits? That they were, yeah, we can see this at least, we are all convinced this is something we need to do faster in different fields, if it's health or if it's cooperation or if it's in the social progress, Gustaf. Could you identify that, this is something, a first step that we need to take?
This is a very hard question, because one of the key messages is actually that there is no recipe that holds true for all regions of the world, so you have to be context specific. And so there are certain proven things which work well, like democratic institutions, and for instance, you have participatory mechanisms that have been tried in various parts of the world and imitated in other parts of the world. So that's the kind of thing that is pushed very hard by the report. I'm not sure it's a low-hanging fruit. It's actually a bit tricky to make it work well, because it's easy to capture participatory mechanisms by some local elites and so on. So this is one, at least this is one thing that is pushed by many chapters in various ways. So the corporation, but also local cities and jurisdictions and so on. Just one example.
Gustaf?
This made me think about, one of the, for me, surprising results is where people would converge, and it came up in your discussion with Kerstin Sahlin. What about the future of capitalism? And the interesting thing is, even some people say like you that there is a future, some people, I'm not sure. But something that seems to be a complete agreement on is the importance of markets. And that's for allocating goods and for price signals. And that's coming out very clearly. And then, of course, even if you're a market, you can have privately owned company, or you can have companies owned by employees or other things. There's a little bit of discussion about that. But that was, I think, that you should have this diversity of different kind of companies in a market. That I think, well, I would call that a low-hanging fruit. That seems to be broader consensus on that.
About low-hanging fruits. In the health field, there is consensus in the World Health Community, more or less, World Health Organization, and all the commissions that have looked at health and health inequalities, that children's early environment is a key factor for health in the country. I mean, it's a long-term investment to invest in health to actually get healthy adults, but it's the best way, and it's consensus around that, and it's very much cheaper to do that than to wait later and solve the problems that come up. And so schooling for all children around the world, and
less money for retired people.
No, I didn't say that.
But you wrote it, didn't you? No, but the avkastning på investering, or the return on investment was higher than.
Our James Heckman has done this famous graph where he shows that the return to investment in childhood is much bigger than return to investment in adult life or later in life, and that's probably true. But you don't need to put one against the other.
Especially because it's going to cost much more later on. Even so you save money by doing it early on. So you save money that you can then use for your retirement, if that's what you're worried about.
Even to be retired.
And that's why the Finnish school system is better than the Swedish, because they put a lot of money in the beginning of the school system. The Finnish state school system is a good one.
Yes, so that's a conversation I'd like to have in the second part, in a way, but perhaps I can give some idea. I think indeed we can make the best of the institutions we have, but combine them. So we need the markets, but we need to tame the market and better understand that there are important failures in the market. We need to have efficient governments, and there are important failures in governments as well. It's not just market failures, you also have government failures. And so if we can play with that, and also look at, so you need to mobilize all the key institutions. And usually people talk about the market and the government, but you have two other key institutions. One is the corporation, the productive firm, and you need to change that in order to, so combining change in that. And the other is the family. The family is often neglected. We're talking about pensioners versus children, but what happens in the family is really shaping people's lives. That's where they start their life, and a lot of things happen in terms of power relation and so on, which are important as well. So mobilizing these four, changing these four institutions, better regulation of markets, more efficient governments, transformation of corporations, and better families, all that together, that would be the 1.5 scenario.
Any other questions or thoughts?
So animals is indeed an important thing, and Marc actually did bring it up, that our views about animals have changed very much. So, and this idea that we should also have this expanding circle, that's an important thing we spoke about.
Yeah.
So we did speak about it.
And may I also answer it, because Marc mentioned the widening of the circle of care that also involves animals. And humans are animals too, and capitalists are animals as well. Is there any other thoughts on? But we can actually
maybe you can
bring
pick up on that
animal
question, because you like to ask that annoying question about who are the enemies, rather than about who are the friends. And I think here it's important to make a distinction what people, the values people hold in their private life and what they are locked into in their institutional roles. And one way to put it, that if you just take climate change as one example, that if we go beyond 2 degrees and go to 4 degrees, that won't be good for any kind of communist utopia, nor for the business climate. So it's very, very few people. So that actually gives me some hope that most of these things are actually in most people's interest. There are, of course, people who, when you face things like that, you deny it. So, Claude, if you deny the facts, if you're a climate change denier, that's a problem, and you can deny these other things. Right. But the more we see of it, the less that denial will be. And I went to this kind of conference recently in Oxford where there were all these high-flying, scary lawyers from these big London law firms. And they came and listened. They were not like idealist hippies, and still they came and listened to a talk I gave about the rights of future generations. Why? Well, they are now realized that they think that the science is getting better, so you can trace which company their kind of emissions, and you can trace that to certain kind of effects, which means you can sue them. So they got very interested, both to be able to sue them and to defend them. So by, so say, changing a little bit of the rules, you can make even people who perhaps don't care so much work in the right way.
Marc?
Yeah, I think I didn't fully answer your question about the enemies, right? I don't have any enemy, but it's true that whenever you propose to change the rules of the game, some who will lose some of their power and privileges will not be happy. But I wanted to give a related example which connects to what Gustaf was saying. The problem of stranded assets. So we have if we want to keep the climate under check, we need to keep most of our coal reserves and a lot of our oil reserves in the ground. But the firms which have rights over these, that will be a big loss in their value. And so when people talk about a new financial crisis, one possible cause for a new financial crisis would be the devaluation of these stranded assets. And of course, the people who hold these assets will fight very strongly against that. And so the big lobby in the US, for instance, is really trying to push for the quick exploitation during 4 years or 8 years of a Republican president to exploit these assets before it's too late, because they know at some point they will lose their value. So this, they are not enemies, but of course they try to stick to the values that they don't want to lose.
Something that we are very fond of here in Sweden, and especially if we are in other countries, is our welfare system. But Gustaf, you have even talked about developing it into another system. Can you explain what it is that you would like to see? rather.
Actually, this is more Marc's chapter, what you worked on, so I can start and you can fill in. But the idea is to, so say, move on to perhaps a further step, which is called in the report the emancipatory state. And that is, I mean, the welfare state has worked well in many ways, but has been very much tied to having the idea of a nation state. And the idea of the emancipatory state is more to stress keeping people on their feet, giving them their autonomy, but also not only freedom to not being stopped by other people, but actually to be able to exercise their freedom. And a state that moves much more in that direction. And also, if you look at the kind of tendency in the World Value Survey, with people's much more stress on autonomy, on self-realization, that seems to go hand in hand with the way that people think about these things.
Did he understand you right, Marc?
Yeah, and it's good because I have too many slides for the second part, so I will be able to go very quickly.
Okay. Well, we come back to that, because now then it's coffee for half an hour, and we'll meet here again at 3. And thank you very much.
Thank you.